Madhouse is a 1974 horror movie, but more appropriately, gothic horror movie, starring, of course, Vincent Price. So, there are other multiple notable actors, names, and scenes to other movies that seem to be this huge homage to the horror movie genre pretty much up to that point, and of course, a nod to Vincent Price's, early career. So the premise to the movie is that Vincent Price's character, Paul Toombs, is an actor that's mostly famously known for being the character Dr. Death. So his character and Peter Cushing's, who's named Herbert Flay, created the character Dr. Death together. So Toombs, Vincent Price, acted as the character, and Flay had wrote, pretty much everything. So Paul gets into a fight with his fiance in the beginning of the film, and Paul misinterprets her starting out her career in film as an adult actress the wrong way. He one of the other characters, was like, well, she used to record adult films with me, and Paul Toombs took that as, oh, she's just using me to get an actual career. She doesn't actually love me, right? So they get into a fight, and his fiance goes upstairs, and basically she gets murdered not long after. Seemingly, she was murdered by Paul. Paul went to trial and was acquitted of the murder and spent about 12 years or so in a mental institution, or at least it's 12 years between like the death and the time he sees Peter Cushing's character again. The trial and all that's not seen in the film. It's just mentioned in passing. Really, the most we get for a scene depicting this is Vincent Price getting like a shot in his arm, and that's pretty much it. But after the murder, Paul Toombs didn't plan on going back to really film or, of course, his role as Dr. Death. But Herbert Flay tricks him into doing so because he invites him to his house for what he originally was led to believe was a different project. So various people are murdered in the movie in similar fashions to what was done in the films for Dr. Death in the past. Most, if not all, of these clips are actually from previous films that Vincent Price had been in the past, during his earlier parts of his career. So it does become clear, though, later on in the movie that Paul was being framed for the murders, and definitely that someone was trying to kill him. So at the end, it's revealed that it was actually a combination effort between the producer, Quayle, and Herbert Flay, Peter Cushing. So Herbert is seen signing a new contract to be the new Dr. Death, and takes home what was the final film of Paul Toombs, because Vincent Price's character pretty much immolates himself. He sets himself on fire in a room. But when Peter Cushing comes home and he watches the film, Paul comes out of the screen and into real life, where he asks Herbert why he killed all the people and framed him. So from there, they get into a fight, and Herbert reveals that he was jealous of Paul, and it should have been him, right? And I'll stop it there because I don't want to pretty much spoil the whole thing, but that's essentially how the film works out. It's very gothic. Peter Cushing's character does die, I'll say that much. But I found the movie to actually be very interesting, which is probably surprising if you are already familiar with this film. I actually thought it had a great intro, and it captivated me from the start, and I thought it was well written, believe it or not. The Vincent Price Peter Cushing combo is of course spectacular, though of course Cushing isn't in the film really that much in comparison. But while watching this movie, I had to remind myself to write the review because I found it so interesting. I just couldn't stop watching it, honestly. And I'm not lying. I was like, I really like this a lot. So the movie I thought was very gothic, and it's actually based off of a 1969 book called Devil Day by Angus Hall. And I really couldn't find much about that original book itself. So if I could read it, I would, but there's not even a Wikipedia page for it. But the movie has elements that remind me a lot of many of the Hammer horror films, and there is a very similar tone between this one and actually The House That Dripped Blood. And I know that's not Hammer, but the movies have a very similar gothic tone to them. Looking surprisingly at reviews of the movie online, I was very shocked. I mean, okay, I wasn't like, oh, but I was just like, wait a minute, people don't like this? I was surprised. I was like, really? Strangely enough, I really love this film. And most of the reviews about it were lukewarm at best. And that's modern day and actually even in the past when it first came out. But I really loved all of the nuances to the film, such as the weird spider lady who apparently was like Paul's ex-wife. And I found the use of clips from the old films which gave respect. I found that they were giving respect on names that had passed away, such as Boris Karloff. I thought that was fantastic. I loved it. I think that the film was pretty much like the last of its era, though, and I will say first that it's definitely not the type of film that the 1970s American audience would have been into. And I think that's probably the biggest reason why many of the reviews had been lukewarm when it first came out. Because, this is before the internet and most things are just made for everybody now. But, back in the 70s, I mean, even up into the 2000s, a lot of things couldn't be universal. Germany has their laws about, you can't show like disembodied or what is it, dismembered body parts and stuff like that. So, and a lot of, I know that a lot of really just European countries have a lot of rules against violence in TVs and film. And so I think that's why this movie is very gothic, because it doesn't show a lot of violence and gore. But people expected that back then. By this time, a lot of people were used to blood, violence, gore, crazy stuff, right? Whereas, 14 years earlier, 1960, Black Sunday was a horror film, and you don't see, like, anybody getting covered and drenched in blood at all. But anyway. But by the time this movie first came out, though, horror movies were a lot more violent, scary, and, of course, gruesome. Much, if not all, of the film was actually recorded in the UK, I believe. And as I said before, their rules for showing blood have always been different from the US. So, in comparison, though, from that same year, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre came out. And so, even though that was released in October of 1974, Madhouse was released in March in the US, and then in November in the UK, actually. It seems that the 1970s really began the era of actually scary horror films, where much of the 50s and 60s were gothic. It's like the 50s and 60s were Edgar Allan Poe, whereas, of course, the 70s are literally Texas Chainsaw. Like you have the idea of something scary, and then you have something that's actually scary, right? I think that people of today might find this film too boring because it's not, scary. It's much more, of course, like an Edgar Allan story that was brought to life. In comparison, another film from the 70s is Tombs of the Blind Dead, which was released in 1972, and in comparison, the costumes to the undead were really freaky, So just a couple of years before, you have a movie like that, and you compare it to Madhouse, which one is scarier? I would say Tombs of the Blind Dead is actually more scary. But that doesn't mean Madhouse is a bad movie, in my opinion. Like, I don't think it is. And then another example I did write down in my blog post was actually in 1971, the movie The Other Side of Madness was released. And which, that's not actually a horror film, technically. Granted, it was more an exploitation, but that film, which was about the Tate murders, was the idea of that one was still more scary because at the time, of course, the Tate LaBianca murders were still in people's mind. And that was a real event, which really scared the shit out of people. So my main point is that by the time Madhouse came out, the horror genre changed a lot. What was considered the definition of scary was very different in comparison to 10 years ago. In some ways, you would kind of almost expect Madhouse to have been released in the 60s with how gothic it was. Oh, and another one before I forget, another good example is just the year before, in 1973, The Exorcist was released. And that's another movie that was legitimately really scary for people. It still scares people to this day. So once again, if you compare The Exorcist to Madhouse, which one is scarier? Which one is actually scary? And that's just what I mean. By the time Madhouse came out, the genre was just so different. I don't think that this is the type of movie for someone that somehow has never heard of Vincent Price, but times have changed, life goes on. But if you don't know about Vincent Price or Peter Cushing and at least their career, this might go over your head. They became very famous during a time period where violence, blood, gore, and even sex were just way too taboo to talk about or depict. Madhouse would probably today be best described as a drama if it was released now. I mean, in some ways, you could almost reconstruct this and it would be like a subplot to Breaking Bad. I do actually think that the movie has great storytelling elements to it, believe it or not. But I think that because they didn't go overboard for things like the makeup and the deaths, this is probably what disappointed people. I will admit, I do think that they should have put more effort into the Spider Lady, because the Spider Lady, her character, who is named Faye, basically got into this horrific car crash or she got into a car fire, to sum it up quickly. So she's supposed to be like a burn victim, but you wouldn't think that when you see her. And she used to be really pretty, but then after the car fire, she was really ugly, so to speak. But even still, the makeup for her just really looked like she had a couple of cuts on her face, not like a burn victim. She was supposed to be bald, but that's seen once and never again. I do agree that part could have been worked on a bit more. And I feel like the best point with that character in particular is that if you didn't hear that piece of dialogue, you probably wouldn't understand why she was the way she was. It was really just something said in passing, in a way. The fact that it was that she's a burn victim. That's what I mean. You would have to either go back and rewatch that scene to understand, wait a minute, that's what they meant, But the movie is definitely cheesy, and to me, I like it for that. Vincent Price showed why he was such a great actor. And I think that horror and comedy can go actually quite well together. And I actually laughed a few times when they would do those stupid close-ups of Vincent Price screaming, somebody else screaming. It was so silly, but you could tell it was supposed to be that way too. And I will say, I do believe, not that anyone really has said this, but I do think that Madhouse was intended for the British audience and not the American one. But believe it or not, I gave this movie a 5 out of 5 on Letterboxd. I really like it that much, seriously. The mask for Dr. Death, or at least the murderer version that was chasing people around, was actually really scary. That's pretty creepy. It's creepy, right? But that's probably where people are like, oh, at most it's creepy. It's not scary. But I thought that the Mask of Dr. Death was creepy too, and I liked that. in some ways, to me, it's not just a cheesy gothic film, it's an art piece. And I really love how it pays homage to the horror movies and actors of yesteryear. When I looked at the newspaper archives, there really wasn't much about the film uh, after it was released. You know, you would see a couple of like advertisements for it, but the few reviews for it were lukewarm. It seems, though, that even in 1974, or especially, it depends on how you want to look at it, but people complained that there wasn't enough blood, you know, and I guess in some ways it makes sense, but when you see the characters that are killed, you don't really need to have like blood gushing everywhere. It wouldn't be necessary, you know? But like I said, there really wasn't much about this film in the news archives otherwise. In a weird way, it was kind of like the movie wasn't advertised that much. But overall, though, I think that if you like Vincent Price and his movies, you would probably enjoy this one. You know, I mean, of course, if you like Vincent Price, I think it's hard to find a movie of his that would be bad, right? But I would recommend this one, honestly. Just don't expect to be scared, right?